Hi everyone, welcome to today's pulse community session on technology and human rights. It's a chance to explore some of the issues surrounding the monthly theme and hear from the perspectives of some of our contributors and the next generation of human rights defenders. So my name is Ploy and I am a correspondent at Human Rights Pulse and I will be host for this session. So today, technology and human rights is very much a digital age with technologies developing at lightning speed. So as a result, this has enabled us to grow as a society and ultimately make our lives easier. But this month, technology and human rights is a chance to stop, to think and make sure that this technological progress is not counterproductive for the advancement and promotion of our human rights. So for me, a very recent example, which I'm sure you can all relate to, is the pandemic and the track and trace apps and the production of vaccines, which has obviously helped us in so many ways in terms of being able to record data, so we can analyze trends and decide where measures should be put in place to slow the spread. And the vaccines itself has helped to reduce symptoms and help to create a herd immunity and stuff like that. But the question is, what about our data and privacy rights? What does it mean, tracking in terms of freedom of movement and vaccines, freedom of choice? Are these apps and systems designed with our human rights in mind? And what can we do about them in a future scenario? So I'm joined today by some of our contributors who are going to be telling us a bit more about some of the issues that tech can cause concern for human rights. But before we head into discussing that, please introduce yourselves, and on a positive note, how has technology helped you to secure some of your human rights, or perhaps human rights for society as a whole? Anyone can go first.
I can go first. Thanks, Ploy. So I'm Lucy Hollington and I'm the Senior Legal and Advocacy Officer at the Consortium for Street Children. So I've been working with children and young people for over a decade now. And I've also spent time in Geneva working on the UN human rights system that's based over there. And the article that I wrote on this topic focused on technology and children's rights. So to answer your question about the positive impact, I think technology offers children around the world a possibility to connect with each other and to form communities in a way that never would have been possible before. We know that children are often ignored by the adults around them, but in the online space, they can forge children's spaces where they can speak out, and things like the youth climate movement and the Indigenous rights movements from children have really flourished in the online community. And we've seen Indigenous children from Brazil linking up with Indigenous children from Iceland in a way that never would have been possible before. So for me, that's one of the real strengths that technology can bring to child rights.
That's great, thanks Lucy. And I just wanted to add, that's so true, isn't it? Because actually we all want to belong somewhere, and if you can't connect or communicate that or have a platform to do so, you can often feel quite isolated. But I'm interested to go into that a bit more later.
I can go next. My name is Anita. I am currently a county court advocate, and I am actively working to start my career as a public lawyer, or well, more specifically as a public law barrister in the UK. And my article was about a Twitter ban issued by Nigeria in June 2021. And so following from that, I would like to say that in terms of the positive impact that to human rights that technology has caused, I would say that freedom of expression is at the center of that. I think that through the internet and through social media outlets, people are unable to hold their opinions and to receive and impart information ideally without the interference of the state. And I find that this is why public authorities and states all over the world are so active in trying to suppress this right, in trying to regulate and to control people in the way that they interact and express themselves online. And this has been, evidenced through clampdown on social media protests, and even, for example, in Saudi Arabia in May 2018, the government carried out mass arrests of women advocating online for the women's right to drive. And so if it wasn't such a good outlet for people to let out their discontent with their government, then the government itself in many different states would not try to clamp it down. Thank you.
Perfect, that's great. Thanks, Anita. Yeah, I think there's, like, again, with children, technology is such a huge scope to express your views. And like you say, if it's not that powerful, then states wouldn't act to try and stop it. So, and interesting that there's so many trends across different countries, especially lately. Or interesting, but rather concerning. Perfect.
Yes, so my name is Matthias, and I'm a contributor for Human Rights Pulse, just as Lucy and Anita. And I'm also a program manager for the Swedish Institute of International Affairs in Stockholm, as well as a master's student at University of Gothenburg. I wrote an article a little bit more than a year ago on internet shutdowns, a phenomenon which becomes more and more frequent in the world. But I was looking at India as a particular case, and also the ramification of internet shutdowns for human rights, and most particularly in the area of Jammu and Kashmir, which is the most common part of India where this is imposed. And for me, I think it's a very good question to ask what technology can do to enhance human rights. It's very often that when we speak about human rights in general, we usually speak about the problems and the ways technology restricts human rights in various ways. I think it's a very good question, and I think encryption, for example, is a very important part of technology which can be used in just both, as Anita was saying, and also Lucy, in a way of how we can mobilize, how people can mobilize, especially in very hostile and authoritarian, but also in democracies where human rights defenders work in order to protect people who work on human rights issues in a way. So I think encryption, and also, of course, social media to make your voice heard on these platforms is very important to mobilize, not just nationally, but also globally in a way that was not possible before internet existed, but also the social media platforms. So I think that's the main important things about technology at the moment.
Perfect, great, thank you. And what I love about these roundtables is that you get to hear how everybody thinks, and sometimes there's overlap, but then there's some new things. Like, I've never thought about the encryption thing, but that is so, so important, because so many, human rights defenders, whether they're journalists or whatever, they're targeted by those in power, those who you're trying to out almost. So yeah, that is a really good one, which I'm so going to look into later. So perfect, everyone. It's nice to start off on a bit of a positive note, and yeah, now I guess we can get into the bulk of the maybe cons of technology, or things that we should perhaps try and look out for, and raise the awareness of it for those in charge. So Matthias, I actually was going to start with you, if that's okay. So yeah, I mean, you've already explained a bit about your article. I guess if you can elaborate a bit more about, what happened, what was the internet shut down, and I know that it could be restricted, the right to use that, but on what basis is that, allowed to happen?
Yeah, sure. I think I will, before I go into like the nitty-gritty of what happened in India and so on, I think it's important to start off kind of having a definition of what is an internet shutdown, what does that entail in many ways. And it's And I mean, the general definition of it is that it's like an intentional, disruption of digital communication by actor. It can be a governmental actor, it can be a non-governmental actor, but it's usually a government that imposes internet shutdowns on certain regions. It can be nationally, it can be a city, it can be a neighborhood or a specific parts of, target specific parts of the population. And it entails, it can lead to a little or, no access at all to internet in this, when they do internet shutdowns. And I mean, it involves, both complete or partially internet blackouts, but it's also shutting off, access or something that is also called throttling to any specific like websites, social media platforms, or apps like WhatsApp or Twitter. So when you're imposed internet shutdown, you don't have access to these things, which are crucial, for people in order to share information, to communicate, or maybe even conduct their work or businesses and so on. And I mean, it can also involve, slowing down internet to a level of, making it completely useless. So going from 4G down to 2G, for example, which was the case in India, in Kashmir, when they reinstated the internet again, but they didn't only apply 2G in 2020, when after they had like one of the world's longest periods of a complete internet shutdown between August 2019 and February 2020. I can go more into detail on why on that later. But why states are performing this and impose these internet shutdowns, the main reason is to control the flow of information, and this is mainly justified by states as a security measure, to ensure public safety, national security, and to stop the spread of misinformation and hate speech. But what many reports shows that, for example, Access Now, is that it's very common for states to use this as a security measure when it's, protests, it's the risk of state violence, police brutality in regions and areas where there are, certain, conflicts and protests and so on. So it's a way of states use this as a tool of shutting down dissent and targeting parts of social movements and so on. And I mean, Jammu and Kashmir is a very specific case. Of course, it's a very conflict region. Has conflict has been going on since the independence and since colonial times in India as well. So, it's very much used as a tool of militarization of that area as well. And India, for example, if we look at India has been for a couple of years now the world leader of using this tool as a security measure. So we can look at the numbers, for example. And I mean, they are the leader by far as well. So if you look at in 2019, for example, I mean, India, according to Access Now, India was responsible for 121 out of 213 reported internet shutdowns of the world. In 2020, they were responsible for 109 out of 155 globally of internet shutdowns. It's a number of them. And this can be compared to other countries, like, the second most usual, it was Venezuela in 2019, who had 12 shutdowns, or Yemen in 2020, who had 6 cases of shutdowns. So it's very often used frequently in India. And in the case of, if we take Jammu and Kashmir as the case here, and according to Deutsche Welle, who did a report in 2020, between 2012 and 2020, every second shutdown in India took place in that region, and it has been mostly during protests and in the risk of state violence, and in the case of in between August of 2019 and to the end of January in 2020, as I mentioned, was a period of complete or partly shut down in the whole region. And this was imposed due to longevity of different, the very, it was protests against, the citizen amendment law that was passed in 2019, which granted citizenship to migrants in India, but it was defined out of what type of religion, out of the religious identity you had, which excluded Muslims, which led to massive protests in the region of Kashmir, where the majority are Muslims, and to add on that is also the revoke of Article 370 in the Constitution, which gave the region an autonomous status within India, which also led to major protests. And when that article was revoked, at the same time, the Indian government imposed internet shutdowns on that region. And what that led to was, of course, it was impossible for people who protested to report if there were, abuses and, state violence and abuse of protest movements, or information was going on the streets and different parts of the region. It was almost impossible for journalists to get information out and get that published, or people to get information about healthcare and so on. And this is also, this is also a consequence in 2020, of course, during the pandemic in this region. It was very difficult for people to get updated information about COVID-19 and the pandemic, and to get healthcare service, and the consequences for education, and to be able to participate in school and so on. Yeah, we can come back to this later. I think I stopped there for the moment, but yeah.
Perfect. No, that's great. Thanks for explaining what the internet shutdown is, and also what was the situation in India. I think it's really interesting, and I think you really exemplifies the fact that how much of a powerful tool governments can use. I don't know if this is a silly question, but is the internet owned by the government? Is that why they can do it, or is the internet owned by a company and they have influence? I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, because there is no off and on switch on internet, which is really important to know. So there's, in India, for example, it's mainly internet service providers, as they are called, ISPs. So there's private companies and private ownership of that. But what the state does is that they order these ISPs to restrict access in internet. And in the fear of litigations and fear of legal repercussions from the state, they often comply to what the state orders. So yeah, that's the answer to that question. I guess there's no off and on switch that the state has in that sense. It's yeah.
Perfect. Okay, no, that's good. That definitely clarifies it for me. I guess my question for you, and also to Lucy and Anita, if you have any thoughts, is what can we or the government do, or the internet providers do, to, I don't know, I guess balance, or whether they should turn it off, if there's an actual threat to security, whatever it is, or it's so clear that it's in retaliation to a protest, to a government policy or a law. What can we do to stop that from happening? Is protest the only way forward, or what? Because the reasons these people are protesting are issues like discrimination and all the citizenship rights. Those are our fundamental human rights. So what lessons could we kind of learn from this situation in India?
I can go first. I think it's if we take it up to maybe an international community, the level of international community, there's, it has been, the last decade has been a lot of catching up in the international community, of realizing that what is going on online is also what's going on offline in that sense. So we live our lives in the internet. So during the last decade, I mean, you have a couple of resolutions in the UN Human Rights Council, for example, where you have affirmed that the same rights should apply online as they do on offline. And in 2016, for example, the General Assembly adopted a resolution that also stated that internet, for example, is a human right, but also that the same rights should apply in online, for example. So I think that's, I mean, a first step for the international communities maybe to recognize that, I mean, you recognize the importance of also maybe having a binding agreement to this. Now it's not, now it's not binding, for example. I think, I mean, I think it's really, really important to have laws also in place nationally that really defines when what is a security threat, for example. I mean, at the moment it's very, I mean, security in that sense, it's a very descriptive, it's not an objective thing, it's a very descriptive thing that is, I mean, you can't just objectively look at security for something. It depends on what the government defines as a security threat. So if there is a self-determination, movement inside of some couple of, different regions in India, they are viewed as a security threat for that nation, and then they will use all the tools, that they have at their disposal, and internet shutdowns. And I mean, if there are cases in India now, I mean, the Supreme Court has I mean, it's been up to the Supreme Court of India, these cases that happened in Kashmir, which was, said to be unlawful in that sense. But I mean, what we see is that states and authorities, they continue to use this very arbitrarily. You have cases when there are some states and there is one state in India that they use it just to shut down internet during exams in order to avoid people from cheating. So the whole region basically are without internet in that sense during a couple of hours, and that affects businesses, it affects the economy, it affects people, not just human rights in that sense, but it affects India, and people lose a lot of of their means of survival, of course, during these hours. Yeah.
No, that's great.
I don't know if I answered the question, but
Lucy, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to come in on this, and just what Matthias is saying is completely true, that we've had a lag in the international human rights world and in governments' understanding of the ways that new technologies intersect with rights. And I think a lot of this raises for me a lot of questions about business and human rights as well, because we know that the business and human rights agenda is starting to be pushed more forcefully, but this is something that we hear from children a lot, is that they want more accountability for these technological providers, that they have a duty, a rights-bearing duty, and that they have to be able to be held accountable, and that states have to take proactive action on that, because as Matthias is saying, you have internet service providers who are complicit in state rights restrictions on the one hand. On the other hand, you have serious rights threats posed by social media platforms to children, for example. The threat of grooming and radicalization is significant. And the recognition, as Matthias said so eloquently, that rights exist in the online space. They're the same rights. And if a state wants to restrict many of our kind of basic rights in normal circumstances, they have to meet a set of criteria, which include proportionality, and those are just not being applied when it comes to digital restrictions in the same way. And I think the movement that we've got towards recognizing the business and human rights agenda is positive, but if anyone's been involved in that space, we also know how big an influence the tech companies themselves have in that space, and that troubles me, because what we're not doing is learning from our non-digital experiences. We too often treat these things like the internet shutdowns in Jammu and Kashmir like they're completely new and unheard of, but actually we should be seeing real parallels with threats to rights that we've seen for decades and decades, and applying what we've learned there. So like you said, I think there are magnificent possibilities offered by the internet, but these threats need to be taken seriously if we're going to reap the benefits that we want to.
Perfect, thanks Lucy. Yeah, I mean, I know I should probably know this, but until I heard you say digital rights are the same as the ones, you know, offline, like that is so true. Maybe the way we've been going, it's just been a bit too narrow-minded, and perhaps we just need to take a step back and actually, yeah, like take the lessons, because, you know, we've got to today for a reason, through a lot of obstacles, and it's not necessarily going back to square one. Perfect. Anita, did you have something to say too?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on what Lucy and Matthias said about human rights being the same in the real world as they are in the internet space. I think that's very true. I think there has definitely been a transition of what society was in reality to, it's almost as though there's been an exodus. We've all moved to the internet space, especially following the pandemic, where we were forced to actually inhabit the internet rather than the real world. And my answer to your question, based on what I've just said, is that the only thing that we can continue to do as a community is to raise our voices. If we cannot do that on the internet space, then we go back to the traditional roots, and we just continue protesting. We just continue holding states accountable for what they've been doing. Because that is at the root of democracy at the end of the day. And if they do not want to uphold that, the demos, the people, have to take it upon themselves to actually make sure that democracy remains what it is and is up to the standard that it should be. Yes, that's mainly what I wanted to say. I also wanted to point out that there are ways in which people have been able to circumvent the sort of limitations that states have placed on them in terms of using social media outlets and the internet. So for example, in my article, I spoke about Nigerians being able to use virtual private networks to access Twitter anyway. And that's where the protests continued, and that's where the protests intensified. You know, they were able to tell the whole world that this is what is happening to us, and it's not fair. We're being robbed of our freedom of expression. And you know, this circumvention has actually led to tangible results, because I think it was just last week on the 13th of January that Nigeria lifted this ban. And so, yeah, the long and short of the answer is we have to continue protesting and speaking up.
Perfect, thank you, Anita. And I think this is probably a good time to just go into your article a bit more. One of my questions was going to be, you know, what's happened since your article, but you've answered that, so that's true. And I guess brings back to, you know, the stance of, even if we just continue to talk about it, shout about it, write about it, as long as we try and get the message out there, perhaps some countries that aren't in a ban or whatever, then the awareness will hopefully find its way back to get a bit of justice. So yeah, I mean, do you want to go into a bit more about what your article was about, you know, and I guess how was Twitter used to further human rights, and also how did Twitter react, and should they have done more? A bit linking back to what Lucy said about accountability for businesses.
So my article is, in summary, it's basically highlighting a situation where the government saw a problem. They saw that through Twitter, they couldn't, or through many social media outlets, they couldn't exert as much control as they would have liked to in terms of the way in which Nigerians express themselves, especially with regards to the government. And so they saw the problem. They couldn't control the problem, and so they decided to eliminate it completely. This, I guess this brought about a lot of uproar in terms of Nigerians, and also in terms of the establishment of Twitter as well, because it's mainly the fact that Nigerians feared that they would be isolated from the rest of the world, there's a fear that your human rights can be trampled upon even more when you cannot speak out and tell the rest of the world what you're going through. And so that was the main issue. Nigerians spoke about it through virtual private networks, as I've just said. And Twitter itself actually came out to show support to Nigerians and pledged to find ways to make sure that their freedom of expression was upheld and that they could still use Twitter services. So what has happened since then is that negotiations have happened between the Nigerian federal government and Twitter. And this is as the Nigerian government wants to I guess they want to have a bit more control in terms of what people can and cannot do by using the Twitter platform. And so they've asked Twitter to accept some regulation in terms of how Nigeria wants Nigerians to use Twitter, and for Twitter to also establish itself in Nigeria, so that the government can actually control it a bit more. And I think it's a starting point. I think it's a starting point in the sense that it shows what protests can do. It shows what resilience in protests can do. And, we start with this compromise, but if we raise our voices even further, we might get to a point where the government's wishes to regulate people in the way that they use the internet will be frustrated completely.
Okay, that's really interesting. I guess I'm kind of surprised to hear that Twitter actually responded in a positive way as well. I feel like you don't hear as much about the positive things that they, companies and like that do. So yeah, that's interesting. And you're right, as a compromise, I bet the Nigerian government never thought that they would ever try to negotiate this point when there were all the protests and uproar before. I guess a question to you on the floor is, do you think, is it a red flag? Do you think it will work in terms of Nigerian government asking Twitter to put in conditions as well as setting themselves up in Nigeria? I guess for me, I feel a bit like if they're there, they might turn up and like force Twitter people to code something on, to stop people from using it or something like that. But just keen to know what everyone's opinions are on that.
I would say that it is slightly red in terms of the color of the flag, because it looks like we've gone one step forward, but then at the same time we've gone 2 steps backwards. We're trying to gain freedom of expression, but then at the same time we're gaining it by being limited in our expression. So it is a bit of a red flag. But my hope, I guess, lies in the fact that, I have hope in the sense that what they're engaging now is negotiations. So it's not a unilateral decision by Nigeria to say, we're going to regulate Twitter and that's the only way that Nigerians are going to be able to use it. We're yet to see the outcome of these negotiations, but I do believe that Twitter will stand its grounds in terms of allowing for these regulations to be kept at the very minimum. just because at the end of the day, it's a business, and they might lose potential customers from the rest of the world if they are seen as enabling governments in their quest to shut down people's freedom of expression.
Perfect, that's great. And yeah, I guess in these situations, you definitely have to be hopeful. So you're doing one step better than I am. Did anybody else have any thoughts on that? No worries if not.
I think the only thing to add to what Anita has said is that, yeah, I think there's a lot of red on that flag for sure, which for me is also because in this scenario, we end up in this slightly perverse position where a private business are defending a right that the government has an obligation to uphold for its citizens. And that feels, I mean, that is wrong. And also we're reliant on Twitter, who have clearly responded quite well in this situation, but they're under no obligation to do that. And that's also worrying, right? That we're negotiating between two parties, one of whom has a set of duties, is duty bound by international law. The other one is really not bound by much, if we're honest, at the global level. And the potential for those negotiations to go in different directions is potentially worrying. But I agree with Anita that we have to have hope, and we have to recognise as well that those protests have achieved at least negotiation, which is better than nothing, and is a win that should be celebrated. So yeah, concerning but also hopeful.
Perfect, no, that's absolutely great. Yeah, I guess we'll just have to keep an eye on what happens next. And Anita, you're our go-to person. If anything catastrophic comes along, we'll get you back on the Pulse community session. Perfect. Matthias, are you okay, or do you have any thoughts? You don't have
to. No, I don't think I have anything to add more than just saying that this will probably go on as a long negotiation as with everything. I mean the state, of course, the state wants to, I think it's important that the state is involved, of course, in ways of trying to find ways in this, understanding the technology and the development of technology, especially on internet and social media, in a way that how can we, together with these companies, find ways to stop, hate speech, harassment online, and so on. I think that's very important. And so what Anita said, and also Lucy, is that, I mean, the negotiation is the key here, right? So they're including businesses in the accountability for human rights in that sense. So, I mean, having that work to continue and becoming more defined what that means when it comes to responsibility and so on, it will be crucial. And also the fight to not having the state too much involved in it, but also not the companies to be completely fringed from the accountability that the state is under when it comes to free speech and expression of freedom, and what the limit goes when it comes to discrimination, harassment, and hate speech and so on. So I think it's an interesting year ahead. I think what's going to happen in this area.
Definitely great, yeah, and yeah, I guess the key is having key participants at the table in the negotiations to represent all parties. And I guess with the businesses, they do rely on reputation, so public pressure from people who use it and stuff will hopefully, even if they're not duty bound, keep them in check and keep fighting for the cause. Perfect. So Lucy, do you want to talk a bit about your article, which was about children in the virtual human rights space?
Yeah, for sure. So I wrote my article about a year ago now, actually, when the UN's Committee on the Rights of the Child had just released their 25th general comment, which is on child rights and the digital environment. So a general comment is when a treaty body issues kind of additional guidance to the convention itself, explaining more about a particular theme or a particular article. And so this one was in response to the huge technological developments that have happened in the 32 years since that convention was drafted. And it was a real moment that had been a long time in the making. Almost 1,000 children around the world were consulted in developing it, along with tech companies, governments, NGOs, and lots of different actors. And it's because, as we've been saying, it's such a grey area for so many governments that I think everyone in the child rights world was really excited that something concrete was being put on paper about how to protect children's rights in the context of technologies. But my article focused on one specific set of children's rights, which is their right to be heard. So their Article 12 rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and how digital technology and the pandemic itself has offered opportunities that we should seize in terms of that right. So at the Consortium for Street Children, we're obviously hyper aware of the digital divide and the many children in vulnerable situations, children in rural communities, and children who for all kinds of reasons just don't have access to technology. And at the same time, we're always thinking about how we can mitigate that and how we can harness opportunities when they do come along. So as you might know, for the past few years, the UN's human rights systems have been moving online. There was a lot of chaos when it first started. I don't know if any of you sat through any of the Human Rights Council Zoom meetings when no one could use the raise hand function, but we got to a point of understanding where the technology started to work. And whereas normally you would have to travel to Geneva or to New York in person to sit and deliver a statement, we started to be able to move online, to record video statements and to participate virtually. And this was perfect for us. We are not in a position to fly children without passports into Geneva at a moment's notice, but we are able to give our partners money to buy computers and to buy internet access and to enable children to participate in that way. And so since I wrote my article, the first ever child sat on the first ever street child sat on a panel at the Human Rights Council. We had an incredible annual discussion on the rights of the child where 2 states gave their speaker slots to children, which is something I never thought would happen. Slovenia, and I think the Marshall Islands, gave the floor to a child from their country to speak on behalf of the state, which was incredible. And loads of NGOs, including Consortium for Street Children, did the same. And so we've had this incredible movement towards a democratization of the human rights space, where children, and not just the most privileged children, but actually children whose human rights are being violated day in, day out, and whose voice is never normally heard, were able to attend these meetings and to speak out for what they believed in. So we had Fred from Uganda sat on a panel with the executive director of UNICEF. Ishika from India spoke about how she's been supporting her women and girls in her community to understand their reproductive rights. And then at the Committee on the Rights of the Child Day of General Discussion late last year, which was focused on the theme of alternative care, we had Musa from Tanzania and Balaram from Nepal speak to over 1,000 people in an online meeting about their rights and alternative care. So I think I am often, as skeptical as I am about the business side, which you've just heard, I am very, very excited by the possibility that this moment offers us. And I think sometimes children's rights are seen as the soft side of human rights, and their right to be heard perhaps isn't seen as exciting or as kind of gritty as some of the other rights that we've discussed today. But actually, for children, if we think back to childhood ourselves, being listened to and being heard about rights violations is at the core of us as adults understanding what's happening to them and understanding how we can respond to that and how we can ensure that their rights are protected. So yeah, since I've written that article, some great things have been happening. At the same time, we're worried about going back to the previous model, which I think is a concern for all of us, not just in the child rights space, but all of us have been excited by this democratization and the possibility that that'll be taken away, because for some states it's threatening. As we've said, this ability to bring new voices in is a threat to them. I think we all need to be vigilant about that, and to be as aware as possible of how we can keep those spaces open. So for NGOs like mine, who have ECOSOC accredited status, which gives us access, to really use that access and to hand the floor to other people, to pass the mic to children, to give it to small grassroots organisations who wouldn't normally be in those spaces, is so important. And just maximising those chances, pushing the space bigger and bigger with technology to help us as much as we can. So yeah, hopefully that explains a bit about my article.
That's great. That's an excellent synopsis of your article, and I agree, that is so exciting that children are being given the floor in the human rights space. And I guess what we were talking about before is like the sense of belonging, the need to be heard. Children can't vote, so but these decisions that are happening or not happening are going to affect their future and livelihoods the most. So yeah, I think it's definitely a huge step and a positive step into securing children's human rights. I suppose my question is, so is this only a temporary thing? Like, are they trialing it out, or is this how it's going to be forever? Or is it just a threat that because something's been given, it can be taken away?
I'm not 100% sure how we're going to end up on this, to be honest. We keep going backwards and forwards, and to some extent it's dependent on the COVID situation in Switzerland, because as soon as the Swiss government introduces new restrictions, we all go back online. What has been kind of put forward and proposed with some degree of success is this hybrid model moving forward, where states and Geneva-based NGOs would be in the Palais in Geneva and meet in person, and would continue with this online input being possible. But there are some states, I'm sure we can probably guess who are really resistant to this, and who are members of the council, so have voting rights, and would be able to block that potentially. And as well, we do see the kind of divide between New York and Geneva, where there is typically more civil society space in Geneva for NGOs and other relevant actors to input, whereas the New York space has been more restricted and has continued to be so throughout the pandemic, which is a real challenge for work in that space. So let's see where the pandemic goes, but I think this year will be critical for deciding that, because we're really in that stage of learning to live with the pandemic and deciding how we want to take this forward. So to be seen.
Oh, that's great. No, that's perfect. Well, maybe if we continue to spread the awareness of how great it is that children are getting a seat at the table, then it will be more difficult for them to go back. And yeah, I think one of my questions is going to be like, what is the practical effects of this amendment in real life? But you've answered that with all your excellent examples of how many children have actually been able to appear there, which I think is incredible. Does anybody have any sort of opinions or thoughts about this development, and do you think it could go further, or I don't know, any thoughts?
I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, a very big step in the right direction, because in devising structures that protect people's, and in this case children's, human rights, it's very ironical that the people that they're seeking to protect are never really consulted. And so the best solutions, I think, are born out of active consideration of the experiences and of the plight of people that you're seeking to protect. And so, yeah, I think we're looking at a situation where a situation which promotes effectiveness. I think one thing that it will promote is effectiveness, in the sense that, I've told, or in this case, the child has told the international community that this is where his shoes hurt, and the international community has taken note of that and has or is trying to devise a solution which would sort that out. So yeah, I'm really happy to hear that.
That's great, thank you. And I think I just want to add, how we've been discussing all the other issues about how we could solve it or what the solutions are. I guess in a way you see this article is a good way to sort of wrap up the session, because it's shown what big powers can do to set down criteria into statute, and then how that can actually play out in the real world, such as getting children there to talk about their experiences. And then Anita, like you said, well, now they know that there's problems, what are they going to do about it? So I think it's definitely hopeful, and hopefully all the other issues with internet shutdowns and stuff can catch up and follow suit. I don't know. Perfect. Matthias, did you have anything, or does anyone have anything about technology in general that they want to get off their chest?
I just want to reaffirm what's already being said. I think that what your article, Lucy, points at and what you talked about is just an amazing opportunity, actually. I mean, of taking this development of technology and the way of moving societies into this type of like hybrid environment. It's just how that opens up the floor, as you so greatly have said, like opens up the floor for communities that don't get access to these rooms and these platforms. And it's a very important job that the NGO that you're involved with, that type, pushes so that the floor remains open and can be even more open. So I mean, it opens up not just for children, but for minorities and other parts of human rights, the rights bearers in that sense. I'm really happy about this development, but it's not a giving thing, of course. it's a fight that still goes on and will continue as well.
Perfect, that's great. Well, everybody, thanks so much for joining me. I feel like we could go on for a while about this, but it's been really, really insightful to hear about all the different developments that are going on and things that we should look out for, and also things that we should be hopeful and so proud of the steps that have come so far. This really sort of demonstrates how vast technology and human rights is. So obviously this is not everything, but hopefully people watching can check out some more articles or doing some more reading on this topic, and I guess continue the fight is my last thought. Perfect. All right, thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.